We are in Matthew 27. And what we talked about last week was, the last thing we talked about was Judas and how he was remorseful, yet he did not change his life. Instead, he decided to end his life. And I'm on the wrong page. There we go. End his life. And so that brings us back to Jesus. Matthew, he'll just go to the other character and talk about the other character a while, and then he's back to Jesus again. He kind of hops around a little bit. He goes to Peter, and then he comes back to Jesus. And so this is like, meanwhile, this is what has happened. And so he's back to Jesus, and Jesus is now going to be going before Pilate. So we are in verse 11 of chapter 27, and I'm going to read there. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony that they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now it was the governor's custom at the feast to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew it was out of envy that they had handed Jesus over to him. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message. "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. Verse 21. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "Well, what shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Christ?" Pilate asked. And they all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." All the people answered, "Let his blood be on us and our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Okay, so we had talked, last we had left Jesus, who was at the home of Caiaphas. And remember, this trial had been going on all night, but they waited till morning to take him to Pilate. Like, we just got together and met and decided what his sentence is going to be. And we found him guilty. We've had this trial, and we found him guilty, and now he's going to go to Pilate. When really we discussed that probably what they were getting together to do that morning was they were getting together to figure out, okay, how are we going to sell this to the Romans? We want him dead, and how are we going to get them to go along with our little plan? And that's what happened. So here we go.
Yeah, but they were sneaky because I think they're afraid of the crowd. So they did this at night.
Oh yeah, they're sneaky. So here we are. How are they going to prompt the Romans to convict Jesus? Well, anyone that is opposed to the Romans, a troublemaker or someone that might start a revolt, is going to become a great concern of Pilate. And last week we talked about Pilate's main job was to keep the peace. Keep these people under control. Keep them from revolting. Keep them from, all this kind of stuff. And so what they do is they decide they're going to accuse him of being a tax evader, a troublemaker, and kind of a rebel to overthrow the Roman government. That is found in Luke 23. We're going to be a little bit back and forth today, and I'll read you what it says in Luke 23, verse 1. You're more than welcome to look there too. Luke's account says, "Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, 'We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar, and he claims to be Christ, a king.'" Okay, if Pilate's listened to this, radar just went off. Ding, 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 ding. He wants to be king. Those are cards, and you can sign your name on them. So anyway, Pilate's like, okay, that's interesting. Is he a rival king to Caesar? I think this is where Pilate's thinking is going. So he's going to ask him a question, but you notice Matthew says the question is, are you the king of the Jews? So is Jesus the king of the Jews? Yes. He answers truthfully to that. Yes. Did Pilate say, are you the king of the Romans? No, he didn't. Did he say, are you the king of the whole world? No, he didn't. He said, are you the king of the Jews? And of course, Jesus is going to answer probably, and not the way that Pilate thought he would answer, is what I'm thinking. This is not what I expected him to say. But he says, yeah, I'm the king of the Jews. In a way, he answered to his deity. I am the king of the Jews. Okay? Truthful answer. But the chief priests, the Sanhedrin, the elders, they're all there. They are just yelling out all these different charges, blah, 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 blah. And Jesus is totally silent to them. He never says a word to them. And I think that causes Pilate some amazement. In fact, it says, great amazement of the governor that he doesn't try to defend himself in any way. In fact, he doesn't have anything to say to them at all. Out of respect, he has answered truthfully to Pilate, but he has nothing to say to the Sanhedrin at all. So Matthew tells us that it has become a custom to release a prisoner of the Jews' choice during the Passover. Okay, all these people are crowded into Jerusalem for the Passover feast. The Romans think, as kind of a goodwill gesture, we will do this for the Jewish people, and we will release a prisoner. And it's something that occurred every time they had the Passover. So we are introduced to Barabbas. And how does Matthew describe Barabbas? What's the word he uses? What?
Scoundrel.
Scoundrel? Yours says scoundrel?
Notorious.
Notorious. Okay, so when I hear the word notorious, I think of everybody knows him and knows he's a bad guy. So he was well known for what he had done. He was notorious. Mark and Luke's account both say he had led a revolt, or he was an insurrectionist, and he was involved in a murder. So he's not a good guy. There had been some kind of an uprising toward the Roman government, and he had committed murder during this time. That's why he's behind bars. He is guilty. In my opinion, I think that's probably why Barabbas was the one chosen. Because in Pilate's mind, he's probably thinking, surely these people have enough sense not to let a notorious prisoner like Barabbas go, and I can't find anything wrong with Jesus and what he has done. Surely they will see reason when I propose Barabbas. Okay? We know it's not going to work, but I think that's probably what he's saying. As you go along here, he then goes to the judge's seat. And the judge's seat was a raised platform that had stairs, and this is where the governor would pass down judgment on people. He goes there, and while he is sitting there trying, I guess, to decide how best to handle this situation, a message arrives from his wife. And I think if I were a fly on the wall and Pilate's reading this up from his wife, and it says, you better not have anything to do with this innocent man, or righteous man, as your version may say, because I have had a dream and I've been in agony all day long worried about this. My day has not gone to plan because of this. And Pilate's probably thinking, oh man, what am I going to do now? This had upset her daily routine. She's now sending him a note saying, you got to let this man go. And he's really in a difficult position, Pilate is. I'm not saying that Pilate is innocent, but he is in quite a difficult position here. In the meantime, the Sanhedrin are working the crowd. They are out in that crowd saying, y'all have got to yell for Jesus. I mean, you've got to yell for Barabbas to be released and Jesus to be crucified. They're working it. They're getting everybody on their side, getting them all riled up, getting them ready to go, basically brainwashing the crowd to have Barabbas released. And so when Pilate wants to know, what should I do with Jesus? The answer is, crucify him. Yeah. You know, the Jewish way of dealing with theirs was to stone them. They knew what Roman execution was. It was crucifixion. And so they shout out in the Roman way of dealing with things, and that was to be crucified. And Pilate's efforts are basically useless because the crowd at this point is so one-sided. One-sided.
And they probably didn't, some of them probably didn't even know what they were doing. They just go along with the crowd.
They were just there, and you're going along with the crowd too. And if, well, you know, if you're in the crowd and everybody else is, are you going to be the one that doesn't? You know.
We see that today very much in mob control, that are not controlled.
Right, right, yeah. So I just think at this point, anything that Pilate would have suggested just fell on deaf ears. They're not going to listen to anything else he has to say. We're going to go over this little sheet here in just a minute. If you've got, it should be on the tables. Does everybody have one of these? Okay. Do you have one? Okay. Okay. So, but look at verse 24. What's happening to the crowd?
They got riled up.
Uh-huh. They are riled up. Mine says that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting. Okay, there again, that is exactly what Pilate does not want to happen. Okay, they are getting out of control. His hands are now tied, and so now he does something that the Jews were well aware of. I did not realize this, but he washes his hands, and what that meant to the crowd. Look at Deuteronomy 21. A Jew is going to know exactly what that means. Deuteronomy 21, verses 6 and 7. Okay, verse 6 of Deuteronomy 21. Then all the elders of the town nearest to the body shall wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken in the valley, and they shall declare, our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done. This was a common thing. If you didn't see the crime actually happen and you didn't have anything to do with it, you washed your hands symbolically saying, I didn't have anything to do with this innocent this thing happening to this innocent cow, in this case a cow, you know. Okay, so he's going to use that. He's going to use that, and he is going to physically wash his hands of the matter. And the people...
If you were a Jew, you knew what he was doing.
You knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
Basically, and he even reiterated it, I have nothing to do with his death. I want nothing to do with it, you know. And of course, the crowd's going like, oh yeah, we're going to take all the blame on this. And their words are, you know, we're going to do it, and we're willing to take the consequences of what's going to happen, and our children will take the consequences too.
I think verse 24, verse 25 is one of the saddest verses in the Bible.
Yeah. Let his blood be on us and on our children.
We don't care.
Wow. Yeah. You know... So Pilate is stuck. He must release Barabbas at this point, and he must turn Jesus over to be killed. By the way, John's gospel has already had, the scourging has already taken place. Matthew, he lumps things together. He wants you to know what happened, and he hasn't covered it. And so right here he says, oh, by the way, he was scourged and sentenced, and it happened right here. It didn't. It has already happened. And that's why I did this little timeline for you. He wanted his reader to know that both had happened, but not necessarily right this second. So, because the very next event that happened is the soldiers are going to mock Jesus. I'm going to read this first, okay? So let's read verse 27 of chapter 27. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him, put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand and knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews, they said. They spit on him. They took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. So that particular event is very much out of order according to the other gospel accounts. So that's why I wanted you to look at this sheet of paper. Basically, this sheet of paper is when he was taken from Caiaphas to Pilate. And how many times, we looked at all four gospels, and I tried to put them on here, but mostly John gives the correct details of what happened. But what I see when I look at this sheet is how hard Pilate tried to convince them to let him go. It was a lot. So look at 1. Jesus was brought from Caiaphas to Pilate. John 18, verse 28. Today, if you get a chance when you go home, sit down and read all of this at all the accounts. Number 2, Pilate heard the case, and he tried to dismiss the case as a Jewish law issue. John 18:31 and Luke 23, verse 2. 3, Pilate had his first interview with Jesus at the Praetorium. And by the way, the Praetorium is his home. That's where he resides. John 18:33 through 38. 4, he returned to the Jews and he pronounced Jesus' innocence. John 18:38. The crowd arrives and asks that Pilate release the customary prisoner. Mark 15 and verse 8. By the way, all of this takes place before 9 a.m. All of this. Because Jesus is crucified at 9. Okay? 6, Pilate tries to use this as a means of gaining the freedom of Jesus, but it fails. John 18:39 through 40. 7, he had Jesus scourged and brought him to the people for pity. He also claimed him innocent a second time. John 19, verses 6 and 7. Pilate, for the 3rd time, pronounced Jesus innocent and tried to get rid of the case. John 19, 6 through 7. I think I may have been redundant on that. I think that's just what I said. Number 9, Pilate re-entered the Praetorium and interviewed Jesus for the 2nd time. John 19, 8 through 11. He sat down upon the judgment seat and received the message from his wife. Matthew 27, 19, John 19, 12 through 14, and the people condemned Jesus. He tried one final step to gain Jesus' release, but failed, washed his hands of the situation, and sent Jesus to the cross. What I need you to know, too, is sometime during this whole thing, Herod is there. Herod shows up, and he is there. I can't remember which account says that they became friends that day. Herod wanted to show up because he was like, I want to see Jesus perform a miracle. That's what this is all about. And at some point between the flogging and these soldiers doing all of this to him, they put a robe on him. Lonnie he goes, that was Herod's robe. Herod wore a red or purple scarlet robe. What that scarlet robe was a purplish reddish tone. And he thinks that's the robe they put on him. And during this time is this fun and games that the soldiers have with Jesus. Because basically they put the robe on him, they put a staff in his hand, they make the crown of thorns, they're ridiculing, hitting him, making fun of him. This is just fun and games for them right now when all of this is taking place. And all of that took place with Pilate and Herod there. I said last week that Lonnie does believe that Pilate was probably the one that scourged Jesus. So all of that is going on. We don't know the number of people. We know it took place at the Praetorium, this part with the soldiers. How do we know how many? I just don't know that we do. I think it was probably whoever was available at the time.
One of my study sources said that the Romans flogged before crucifixion because many times that killed them.
Yes. Oh, yes. How could you survive that?
When the flogging was over, their life was gone.
And Jesus is weak. When you get to the next part, when they make him carry his cross, he cannot physically carry it at that point. He is already so weakened from that. So they, of course, had taken off his garments to flog him. And that's when the robe or the scarlet, it's a purple color, Herod is there according to Luke's account, and that's just demeaning. Just demeaning him. If it wasn't enough for him to suffer physically, he has to suffer mentally too. And I can't imagine after all of this going on, And he's up all night. He was up all night praying. How he could physically walk the road and carry the crossbeam of his cross. And so it makes it easier for me to understand why physically he just could not do it at that point. So let's move on to the crucifixion part, starting verse 32. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots, and sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head they placed the written charge against him, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way, the robbers who were crucified with him also heaped insults at him. Okay, so we're introduced to yet another character in this story, and this is Simon. As Jesus is trying to get to Golgotha with the crossbeam, he's weak, and the way to the cross is just too difficult. And so they get Simon of Cyrene to come and help him. And Cyrene was a city of northern Africa. I'm sure this man was in town again for the Passover and was just a spectator at the side. And so they grab him and they say, "We would like for you to carry the cross," and he does. And there's going to be a placard that goes above Jesus's head, and Pilate puts on there, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." And we know from the other accounts, they don't like that, because basically he's mocking the Jews when he puts that on that. He's mocking, and they don't like it, and they want it changed, and he says, "I'm not changing it." That's what it's going to say. So one thing that I mentioned last week, that you always see pictures of him hanging fairly high, but Lonnie believes it was probably close to the ground, because animals would come up. Animals would come up and gnaw on them as they were hanging there. And that, I thought that I had never read that before until then. But there was sometimes on a Roman cross, you can look them up, sometimes there was a small beam that came out from the bottom where your feet would rest upon. We know that Jesus, they nailed him to that, but whether he had a place to rest his foot or not, we're not sure whether he did or not on that. But he was basically supported by his limbs once he went up. There was some covering that was allowed for decency, but most of the rest of the body was exposed. And so basically, the victim is left to fate. It could come from blood loss. A lot of those people, like you said, never made it to the crucifixion part, because once they went through the scourging, they died then. And sometimes it was just exhaustion. If you can imagine how utterly exhausting it was to try to get your body up to inhale enough air to keep yourself alive. And basically their lungs would fill up and they would suffocate over time. They just didn't have the strength to keep doing that. And death was a welcome relief to all of that, because it was torture. That's exactly what it was. So they're going to take him to Golgotha. In Aramaic, that means skull. And some of the commentators are like, well, it's because there's skulls laying around everywhere from crucifixions. Well, no. It's actually called that because from a distance, the mountain or that area looks like a skull. And that's why they called it that. The first thing they're going to do once they get Jesus up there is they're going to offer him something to drink. This was most likely a sour wine or vinegar. This was very watered down kind of vinegar. taste. And this is what common people drank, including the Roman soldiers. This is what they drank all the time, this kind of thing. But Luke says it was wine vinegar, and that many times myrrh was added to the drink. Myrrh would make it bitter. That would make it bitter, but it would also numb the senses if you drank it. It would numb the senses and cause the body to relax so that death would come quicker and easier. Jesus is going to refuse this, of course. Your version may say gall. Gall is just a generic term meaning that it was bitter. That it was bitter. A reference to all things bitter. So Jesus is refusing that. Why do you think Jesus refused to drink it once he figured out what was in it? I think he wants to be clear-minded during this entire process. He will not allow himself to be drugged. He is in control of the situation from start to finish. He will let himself suffer. He will let himself die eventually. So he refuses it. Once Jesus is crucified, then they're going to divide up his clothing. And that is according to Scripture too. John 19:23 goes into a little bit more detail about that, about them dividing up his clothing. John 19:23. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them. Okay, there were 4 of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said to one another. Let's decide by lot who will get it. This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled. They divided my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. There were actually 5 pieces of clothing. We get that from that. The pieces of clothing were a turban, sandals, a girdle, and that is just like a leather belt. It was probably leather that went around his waist, an inner and outer garment. And that 5th piece, they didn't want to divide it 4 ways, so they cast lots to see who was going to get that. So one of those 4 guys left with 2 pieces of clothing, or more, depending on the other guys. They probably did the same thing with theirs. So then after they do that, after they've divided up his clothing, they sit down to watch. Why would they need to watch?
Make sure nobody comes taking off the cross.
Exactly. They are going to watch that body. They don't want any disciples, any family members coming along to take any of these bodies down off to try to revive them from this. They're going to wait until they die. And so they are there to guard these victims until death. So this is when Matthew tells you about the placard that was set above Jesus's head. And it was not to shame Jesus. It was clearly to taunt the Jews. Pilate had no reason to dislike Jesus, but he certainly had a reason to not like the Jews. And along with Jesus are 2 other criminals. He's going to be killed with thieves and robbers, and he's innocent of that. And one on his left and one on his right, he was in the middle. We know that they don't have anything good to say to Jesus for a while. I'm not sure what happens when things change, because we do know that one of them is going to he's going to change. He's going to he's going to eventually say enough that God's going to promise him that he sees him in paradise, and so that's kind of interesting. But at this point, they are not on his side, and they are ridiculing him right along with the crowds of people, right along with the Sanhedrin that are there, still doing that. And so he's going to have to endure ridicule as he's hanging there dying. So what do they say about him? This is what I find interesting. One of the things that they say is that in verse 40, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God. They will take Jesus' very words and use those against him. If you look in John chapter 2, this is when I've had a hard time with my voice today. John chapter 2, verse 19. This is what Jesus said exactly. I'll just go to 18 first. Then the Jews demanded of him, "What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." The Jews replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. So what is he talking about? This temple. He's talking about himself and how he is going to die and he will be raised in 3 days. He's talking symbolically about his life, but they're going to take that and they're going to use that as he's hanging there. Twist his words just a little bit to give him a hard time about that. And, to taunt him, basically. He's a dying man, and he's being tortured, and yet they are still hurling insults at him. And they are heartless. And not only the crowds, but the members of the Jewish council are treating him with verbal abuse. They knew him to work miracles, okay? He worked miracles for other peoples. So now they just imply that he's a fake. Yeah, they imply that he was faking it, He could save others, but he can't save himself. They never believe that. They imply that if he could save himself, then we would know he was who he is, but that's a lie. They're going to justify that. They had somebody walking among them for those years, for 3 years, performing all kinds of miracles, including raising people from the dead, and they never believed. Never. What? It's not going to make any bit of difference if they saved him right now. They still would not believe. They're going to find a way.
If they did, it would destroy all their, and they'd be out of a job.
They'd be out of a job, that's right. They had found 1,000 reasons not to believe, and why would this scenario even change their hearts? It's not. They ridicule his divine claim to be the Son of God. Since there will be no miraculous delivery by God from the cross, they will conclude that his claim to be the Son of God is also false. Anyway, eventually the scene changes with the 2 criminals that are hanging there, and one of them repents and asks for forgiveness, and it is a memorable promise that's found in Luke 23:39 through 43, that part, the exchange that happens, that he tells him, "I'll see you today in paradise." So, okay, so let's move on to the death of Jesus. Verse 45. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over all the land. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He's calling Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now, I just want you to this is the same drink, but it doesn't have the gall in it. It doesn't have the myrrh added into it. And the rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Many women were there, watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. And among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joses, and the mother of Zebedee's son. Okay. Let me see what time I have. It's 10:21. Okay, so Jesus has been crucified about the 3rd hour, which would have been 9 a.m. That's Mark 15:25. Matthew will tell us around the 6th hour, or around noon, darkness came over the land. The 9th hour will be around 3 p.m. and the darkness will end. So for about 3 hours, it's going to be dark. We can see from this that the total amount of time that Jesus hung on the cross was around 6 hours. And what does Matthew mean that the land was dark? What land? Is it the world was dark? Or Palestine was dark? I don't really know that it matters, but it's important to know that that was an act of God. Many people will take miracles and they try to convince people that there's a reasonable explanation for this supernatural thing that occurred. They say that darkness was nothing more than an eclipse of the sun. How do we know it wasn't an eclipse of the sun? Well, because we know when the Passovers occur. They occur at the time of a full moon, and eclipses do not occur at the time of a full moon. They don't. This darkness was affected by divine decree because God did it. He did it. And maybe it was done to send a message or convey a lesson in some way for us. We have to take in consideration what was done here and who was dying. This was more than just a sign of an unhappy God over the death of his son. Jesus became man's sin on man's behalf. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. 2 Corinthians 5:21. God therefore turned his face away from his son. Verse 46. Jesus himself says that God had forsaken him. Why had God forsaken him? Because God is too holy to remain in the presence of sin. Look at Habakkuk 1:13. I don't know why Habakkuk is so hard for me to find. I try to find it quickly, and I'm like, I know it's somewhere in here, and I can't find it.
1:13.
Yes. Why don't you read it, Mary?
Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those who are more righteous than themselves?
Okay. So no wonder darkness came on the land. You know, he cannot look upon sin. He cannot look upon sin. I cannot say for certain that this is the reason why darkness came. But I can say for certain that God is grieved over what has occurred, and it was demonstrated with darkness. You know, it was. So it was around 3 p.m. when Jesus cried out, and he quoted one of David's prayers, which is Psalms 22, verse 1. In this, Jesus questioned his abandonment by God. Why have you forsaken me? And that came from David's prayer. We just discussed how he became the sin bearer. In fact, he became sin itself. He represented everything sin was, and God could not stand to look upon it. After he cries out, some of the crowd assumed that he was calling out to Elijah. Jesus had spoken in Aramaic, and it must have been Jews that understood this. He hadn't cried out to Elijah, okay, because we know he was crying out to God. He wasn't crying out to Elijah. The crowd just misunderstood. Jesus is in agony, and his speech would be difficult at this time. In fact, any words would be difficult at this time. He's very close to death. And so all the words that Jesus speaks are short sayings. He doesn't go into detail. They're very, very short. And the word Eloi is very close to the word for Elijah, Eli, E-L-I versus E-L-O-I. And I think that's why they thought he was crying out to Elijah. There is another theory. I mean, Elijah is one of the patriarchs of these Jewish people. And it could be that he's just crying out to a patriarch or to somebody to come and help him and save him. And Elijah was known to be a righteous man and a great prophet. And so perhaps that could be also the reason. Or that they just misunderstood the words that he spoke, because he is crying out to God. We know from John's account that shortly before Jesus' death, he spoke the words, "I thirst." Someone immediately filled a sponge and offered him a drink. And we've talked about this. This is something that the soldiers would have been drinking right there, similar to vinegar, only this time it didn't have anything added into it. And after his drink, they sit back and they say, let's just see if Elijah comes. You know. And I just wonder what they were thinking. Were they thinking, is he going to come? You know, superstitiously? You know, what are they thinking? Is somebody from the heavens going to come and rescue Jesus? Having taken his drink, Jesus will yield to death. Matthew records that he cried out before his death. Luke records that he said, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And John records, "It is finished." It seems logical that Jesus' final words were, "It is finished." The 4 gospel accounts have Jesus giving up or yielding his spirit or breathing his last. None of them say he died. None of them. All of the phrases used give us the impression of the willingness of Jesus to let himself die. He was in control until the very end. No one took his life away. He gave it freely. It was a voluntary act. It wasn't forced. So upon his death, several unexplainable things are going to occur. And I really don't have time to get into it. So we're going to stop there and we're going to pick back up. I hope I gave you something to think about today. This is one of those lessons that I spend a lot of time preparing for, and it is so serious in nature that I can't do it justice. I cannot do it justice. And many times I have read these accounts and put them together. And when we have communion, many times I think about Jesus trying to carry that cross, because that has more impact on me than most things. That he struggled to carry that. And I think he struggled with the whole idea of crucifixion and what it meant for him and what he was going to have to endure. But yet he did it. He volunteered. He volunteered to give his life for us. And so I hope you can benefit from something I said today.
Two great things from this that I always think of is that Jesus did this for me.
Yes.
He did this for me. And the people, the Jewish leaders, and some of the people too, never believed, never accepted that he was the Messiah.
Oh no. They still haven't. They never have, and they never will. So, all right, we're ready to sing.